They told me Varek's world was a stepping stone. A temporary assignment, they said, 6 standard months at most, then a transfer to something better. Maybe a Star Destroyer posting, maybe even Coruscant if I kept my head down and my reports clean. My academy scores were good. Not brilliant, but good enough to matter in the sprawling machinery of Imperial advancement. Lieutenant Kessin Vor, newly minted, freshly pressed uniform still smelling of the fabrication droids back on Karita. I had memorized every regulation in the Imperial officer's manual. I believed in the system. I believed that the Empire was order itself, given shape, a necessary structure holding back the chaos that had consumed the Republic in its final rotting years. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand who I was before I landed on that world, before the shuttle's landing struts sank into reddish mud and the garrison's gates opened to receive me. I was not a cynic. I was not corrupt. I had never taken a bribe, never falsified a report, never looked away from something that demanded my attention. I was the Empire's perfect product. Loyal, efficient, and absolutely certain that the uniform I wore represented something greater than myself. That certainty did not survive Varek's world. The garrison sat on the edge of what the locals called the Rust Flats, a vast mineral plain the color of dried blood, stretching toward distant mountains that never seemed to get any closer, no matter how long you looked at them. The base itself was a standard Imperial prefabricated installation, the kind they dropped on 1,000 Outer Rim worlds. Gray Duracrete walls, watchtowers at each corner, a landing pad for shuttles and light transports, barracks for the stormtrooper complement, an administrative block for officers, and at its center, the command building where Colonel Drav Messin held court over his little kingdom. I reported to him within an hour of my arrival, still brushing Varek's red dust from my uniform. The command building's interior was cooler than the oppressive heat outside. Climate control humming steadily through vents that needed cleaning. A protocol droid led me through corridors that seemed dimmer than regulation allowed, past offices where junior officers hunched over terminals without looking up, past a common room where a handful of personnel sat in silence, their eyes tracking me with an interest that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment, measurement, calculation. Colonel Messin's office was at the end of a long hallway, and when the doors slid open, I got my first look at the man who would teach me everything I never wanted to know about the Empire's true face. He was older than I expected. Late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with gray hair cropped close to his skull, and a face that might have been carved from the same red stone that covered his planet. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they settled on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I didn't. I came to attention, offered my datapad with my transfer orders, and gave my report exactly as I'd been trained. Lieutenant Kessin Vor, reporting for assignment as adjutant to the garrison commander, sir. Messin took the datapad without looking at it. He set it on his desk, a desk cluttered with actual flimsy documents, I noticed, which struck me as unusual even then, and leaned back in his chair. "Adjutant," he said. The word came out flat, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "They keep sending me adjutants. Do you know what happened to the last one, Lieutenant Vor?" "No, sir. He requested a transfer, urgently, practically begged for it." Messin smiled, and something about that smile made the temperature in the room drop, despite the straining climate control. "Couldn't handle the isolation," he said. "The stress of Outer Rim service. The distance from proper Imperial society." He picked up my datapad, finally glanced at the screen, set it down again. "Tell me, Lieutenant, are you the type to request urgent transfers?" "No, sir. I'm here to serve the Empire wherever I'm needed." "The Empire?" Another smile, this one's smaller, more private. "Yes, the Empire. Well, Lieutenant Vor, welcome to Varek's world. I'm sure you'll find your service here educational." That was my first warning. I didn't recognize it as such. The garrison's official purpose was standard outer rim security: maintain Imperial presence, suppress potential rebel activity, protect Imperial interests in the local system. Varek's world itself was marginally habitable, home to perhaps 200,000 colonists spread across a dozen settlements, most of them involved in mineral extraction. The planet produced modest quantities of durasteel ore and certain rare elements used in hyperdrive manufacture. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would draw high-level attention, but enough to justify a garrison and the occasional cargo shuttle. My duties, as I understood them, would involve administrative coordination, personnel management, supply requisitions, and the endless paperwork that kept any Imperial installation functioning. Unglamorous work, but necessary. And I threw myself into it with the enthusiasm of the true believer I still was. It took me 3 days to realize something was wrong. The first sign was the requisitions. I reviewed the garrison supply records as part of my orientation, and the numbers didn't make sense. The personnel complement was 240 troops, 180 stormtroopers, 40 support staff, 20 officers of various ranks. Standard ration allocations for that number should have been straightforward. But the requisitions showed food supplies for nearly 400 personnel, with corresponding increases in medical supplies, equipment, and materiel. When I queried the discrepancy with the quartermaster, a sweating, nervous captain named Torv, he told me not to worry about it. "Wastage," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Harsh environment. Things spoil faster out here. Equipment breaks down. It's all accounted for in the special operational parameters." I asked to see the special operational parameters. Torv told me he'd get back to me. He never did. The second sign was the civilians. The garrison was supposed to be a closed military installation, but I kept seeing unfamiliar faces in the corridors. Beings who didn't wear uniforms, who moved through the base with a comfort that suggested long familiarity. Most were human, but not all. I spotted a Rhodian in the supply warehouse, a pair of Twi'leks leaving the officers' quarters late one night, a scarred Wike who seemed to have permanent access to the motor pool. When I asked about them, I received vague answers about local contractors and support personnel and classified liaison operations. The third sign was the silence. In every Imperial installation I'd ever served, there was chatter. Soldiers complained about their duties, gossiped about their commanders, speculated about their next posting. It was the background noise of military life, as constant as the hum of recycled air. But in Varek's garrison, the troops barely spoke. They performed their duties with mechanical efficiency, answered direct questions with minimal responses, and watched. They were always watching each other, watching me. I told myself it was adjustment. Culture shock. Every posting had its quirks, its unwritten rules that newcomers had to learn. I would adapt. I would do my job. I would earn my transfer to somewhere better and leave Varek's world as a line on my record. Nothing more. That illusion lasted exactly 17 days. It was late evening when Captain Torv came to my quarters, knocking so softly I almost didn't hear it over the drone of my datapad's audio feed. When I opened the door, he slipped inside without invitation, his eyes scanning the corridor behind him before the door sealed. "Lieutenant Vor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." "Captain, is something wrong?" He laughed at that, a strange, broken sound, almost a sob. Wrong. Yes. Yes. You could say that. He moved to the small viewport that looked out over the rust flats, now silver under Varek's double moons. You've been asking questions about the requisitions, about the civilians, about how things work here. I'm doing my job. If there are irregularities, there are no irregularities. He turned to face me, and in the dim light, I saw something in his expression I hadn't expected. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. The kind that lives in the belly and never quite goes away. There is only how things work here, and how they work everywhere else. You need to understand the difference, Lieutenant, or you will not survive your posting. I don't understand. No, you don't. That's why I'm here. He crossed to my desk, sat down heavily in the chair I used for reading, and buried his face in his hands for a long moment. When he looked up again, the fear was still there, but layered now with something like resignation. What do you know about Colonel Messin? His service record. 30 years in the Imperial military, decorated veteran of the Clone Wars, assigned to Outer Rim Garrison Command 8 years ago. Solid performance reviews, no marks against. His official record, Torv interrupted. What do you know about him? That is his official record. Then you know nothing. Torv leaned forward. Colonel Drav Messin runs the largest smuggling operation in this sector. Spice, weapons, slaves, stolen technology. If it can be bought or sold illegally, it passes through this garrison. Half the stormtroopers are on his private payroll. The other half are too terrified to report it. Those civilians you've seen? Business partners, buyers, sellers. Muscle for when negotiations require emphasis. I stared at him. The words registered, but my mind refused to process them. Smuggling, slaves, corruption at this scale, in an Imperial garrison, under an Imperial officer's command. It was impossible. The system didn't allow for it. The oversight mechanisms, the inspections, the chain of command. That's impossible, I said. The Sector MOF receives 30% of all profits. Torv's voice was flat now, the fear giving way to exhausted cynicism. Governor Price on Lothal? She's one of our best customers for off-book weapons. Regional ISB? Colonel Messin has files on half their senior agents. Everyone who matters either profits from this operation or has been compromised by it, and anyone who doesn't fall into those categories. He shrugged. There was an adjutant before the one Messin mentioned. Fresh from the academy, just like you. Idealistic, just like you. He tried to file a report through secure channels. Messin found out within 6 hours. They said he died in a speeder accident on patrol. His body was never recovered. You're lying. I wish I were. Torv stood, moved toward the door, then paused. I'm telling you this because you have a choice, Lieutenant Vor. Right now, tonight, you have a choice. You can pretend this conversation never happened. Keep your head down, do what Messin tells you, take the credits he'll offer you eventually, and maybe, survive long enough to transfer out. Or you can be a hero. Report this through channels. Try to contact someone who isn't already bought. But if you do that, you will die. Not might die. Will die. Messin has been doing this for 8 years. He knows every play in the book. He's killed better people than you or me, and he'll do it again without losing a moment's sleep. He opened the door, checked the corridor again. Why are you telling me this? I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. Because I was you once, 4 years ago, and no one told me? I had to figure it out myself, after I'd already made too many mistakes, already signed my name to too many falsified reports, already become complicit in ways I can never undo. He met my eyes one final time. I don't know why I thought you deserved better. Maybe I just wanted to say it out loud, finally, to admit what we all are here. He left. The door sealed behind him. I stood in my quarters for a long time, listening to my own heartbeat, staring at the twin moons through the viewport, trying to convince myself that everything I'd just heard was a lie. But I knew it wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, datapad in hand, composing and deleting message after message. Reports to Sector Command, queries to Imperial Center. Even, and I still feel the shame of this, anonymous tips to known rebel communication frequencies. Because in my desperation, I had begun to think that maybe the enemy of my enemy was the only ally I had left. I sent none of them. Captain Torv was right. If even half of what he said was true, then any communication I sent would be intercepted, analyzed, traced back to me. I had no evidence that would survive scrutiny, no witnesses who would back my claims, no powerful patrons to shield me from retaliation. I was a junior officer on a forgotten Outer Rim world, utterly alone, surrounded by people who had already decided that the price of survival was complicity. And there was another truth, one I couldn't admit to myself for a long time afterward. I was afraid. Not just of death, though. I was certainly afraid of that. I was afraid of what would happen to my record, my career, my future. I had worked so hard to get where I was. Years of study, years of training, years of believing that if I just followed the rules and did my duty, the system would reward me. The thought of throwing all that away, of becoming a cautionary tale whispered in Academy barracks. Remember Vor, the one who cracked on his first real posting? That thought was somehow almost as frightening as the thought of Messen's retribution. So I made my choice, the coward's choice, the survivor's choice. I kept my head down, and I watched. And I learned exactly how corrupt an Imperial Garrison could become when no one was willing to stop it. The operation was elegant in its brutality. Varek's world sat at the intersection of 3 minor hyperspace routes, far enough from major systems to avoid scrutiny, but accessible enough to serve as a transshipment point for goods that couldn't pass through legitimate channels. The garrison's official patrols, the ones that appeared in reports sent to Sector Command, covered a standard security grid, predictable and documented. But there were other patrols, unofficial ones, that escorted smuggler vessels to hidden landing sites in the mountains beyond the Rust Flats. There were cargo manifests that existed only in encrypted files on Messen's personal terminal. There were payments made in untraceable credit chips, distributed to loyal personnel at irregular intervals, always in amounts small enough to avoid automated financial monitoring, but large enough to ensure silence. The slave trade was the worst of it. I learned about it gradually, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations, unexplained movements, the haunted expressions on certain stormtroopers' faces when they returned from special security operations. Messen had connections with Zagarian slavers, remnants of an enterprise the Republic had supposedly crushed decades ago. They brought their cargo through Varek's world, beings from a dozen species, mostly taken from unprotected Outer Rim settlements, bound for labor camps, pleasure houses, and worse. The garrison provided secure holding facilities, forged documentation, and muscle when needed. In return, Messen received a percentage of every sale. I never saw the holding facilities myself. They were in a section of the base officially designated as hazardous material storage, accessible only to personnel with specific clearance codes. but I heard things. Late at night, when the base was quiet and the recycled air carried sounds from distant corridors, I heard things that I will not describe here, because describing them would make them more real. And I have spent years trying to make them less real, and I have failed. What I can describe is the way corruption spreads. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments, each one small enough to rationalize, each one leading inexorably to the next. My first compromise was silence. I saw things I should have reported, discrepancies in patrol schedules, unfamiliar vessels on the landing pad, civilians where civilians shouldn't be. And I said nothing. I told myself I was gathering evidence, biding my time, waiting for the right moment to act. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it even then. My second compromise was participation. 2 months into my posting, Messin called me into his office and handed me a data pad. "Supply requisitions for the next quarter," he said. "Standard procedure. I need your authorization code as adjutant." I looked at the numbers. They were false. Wildly inflated quantities, phantom personnel, fictional operational requirements. My authorization would make me an official party to the fraud. "Colonel," I said carefully, "these figures don't match our actual—" "Lieutenant Vore." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "I'm not asking you to audit the figures. I'm asking you to authorize them. That's your job. That's why you're here. To make the paperwork clean." He smiled that cold smile I had come to dread. "You've been with us long enough to understand how things work. Captain Torv spoke with you, I know. He speaks with all the new arrivals. Considers it a kindness." The smile widened fractionally. "I allow it because it simplifies things. Saves me the trouble of explanations." I looked at the data pad. I looked at Messin. I thought about the adjutant who had died in a speeder accident, whose body was never recovered. I entered my authorization code. After that, it became easier. Isn't that always how it works? The first transgression is the hardest. The second is merely difficult. The third is routine. By my 4th month on Varek's world, I was processing falsified documents without hesitation, coordinating patrol schedules to create gaps for smuggler vessels, and attending meetings where Messin discussed his business empire with the casual frankness of a legitimate merchant reviewing quarterly profits. The credits started appearing in my account shortly after. Small deposits, untraceable, never quite enough to trigger any alerts. I told myself I wasn't taking bribes. I told myself it was just compensation. Hazard pay for a difficult posting, a reward for efficiency. The same rationalizations every corrupt official has made since the beginning of recorded history, and just as hollow. But the credits were real, and the silence I purchased with them was real. And the person I was becoming was real, even as the person I had been faded into a memory I could barely recognize. There were others like me. Not everyone in the garrison was a willing participant in Messin's operation. Some were simply trapped, compromised by circumstance or coercion, doing what they had to do to survive. I found a strange solidarity with them, a shared understanding that needed no words. We recognized each other by the way we avoided eye contact in the corridors, the way we flinched at sudden noises, the way we drank too much at the officers' club and said too little. Captain Torv and I developed something like friendship, though we rarely spoke directly about the situation we shared. We played Dejarik in the common room, discussed inconsequential matters, the weather on Varek's world, always hot, always dusty, the latest holodramas from the core, always melodramatic, always escapist, the rumors of rebel activity in nearby systems, always exaggerated according to official reports. These conversations were a kind of performance, I think. A way of pretending we were normal officers in a normal garrison, living normal lives, untainted by the horrors we had witnessed. But sometimes, late at night, when the base was quiet and the bottle was empty, Torv would say things, fragments, confessions that came out sideways, never quite direct. "There was a girl," he said once, staring at the dregs of Corellian whiskey in his glass. "Twi'lek. Couldn't have been more than 16 standard years. They brought her through 6 months before you arrived. She looked at me when they were moving her to the holding area. Just looked at me. Didn't say anything, didn't scream, didn't beg. Just looked. And I walked away. I walked away, Vor. I've been walking away ever since. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. The worst part, and I need you to understand this, whoever you are, reading these words. The worst part wasn't the fear or the guilt or the moral decay. The worst part was how normal it all began to feel. How quickly the unthinkable became routine. After 6 months on Varek's world, I could look at a cargo manifest for agricultural equipment and know it meant weapons bound for criminal syndicates. And I would feel nothing. I could hear the muffled sounds from the hazardous material storage section and keep walking without breaking stride. I could sit across from Colonel Messon as he discussed the market price of sentient beings and nod in all the right places. I had become the thing I once despised, and I hadn't even noticed the transformation happening. The Empire did this to me. I understand that now, with the clarity of distance and time. The Empire created a system in which corruption was not an aberration, but an inevitability. A system where men like Messon could flourish precisely because the apparatus of oversight had been designed to protect power rather than justice. Where loyalty was measured not by adherence to principle, but by willingness to obey. Where the chain of command was also a chain of complicity that bound everyone from the lowest stormtrooper to the highest moth in a web of mutual incrimination. But I also did this to me. I made choices, small choices, day after day, each one a step further down a path I could have refused to walk. I could have died with my integrity intact. Others did. I learned later about officers on other worlds who chose that path, who reported corruption through whatever channels remained uncorrupted and paid for their courage with their lives. They were heroes. I was not. I want to tell you that something changed, that there was a moment of awakening, a crisis of conscience that forced me to confront what I had become and choose a different path. But the truth is more mundane, more pathetic. What changed was this. After 16 months on Varek's world, I received notification of a transfer. I still don't know why. Perhaps Sector Command decided they needed bodies elsewhere. Perhaps one of Messon's patrons arranged it as a favor. Perhaps it was simply the random churning of Imperial bureaucracy, moving pieces around a board too vast for any individual to comprehend. Whatever the reason, the orders arrived on a standard courier shuttle. Lieutenant Kessin Vor was to report to the garrison on Denagra, a mid-rim agricultural world, within 30 standard days. When Messon called me into his office to discuss the transfer, I don't know what I expected. Resistance, perhaps. Threats. A reminder of all the secrets I carried, all the documents I had signed, all the ways he could destroy me if I ever spoke of what I had seen. Instead, he simply nodded. Denagra, he said, as if tasting the word. Quiet posting. Good for someone looking to move up. You've done well here, Vor. Kept your head down, learned how things work. That's valuable. He reached into his desk and produced a small case, which he slid across to me. A gift, For your service." I opened the case. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a chronometer. An expensive one, the kind senior officers wore as status symbols. Its face was inscribed with a date, the day I had arrived on Varek's world. "Something to remember us by," Messon said, "and a reminder." His pale eyes held mine. "You're one of us now, Lieutenant. Wherever you go, whatever you do, that doesn't change. The Empire is built on men like us, men who understand that the official story and the real story are two different things, and that survival depends on knowing which one matters." I took the chronometer. I thanked him for the opportunity to serve. I packed my belongings, said my farewells to Captain Torv and the others I had come to know in that place, and boarded a shuttle bound for the orbital transfer station. When the shuttle lifted off and Varek's world fell away beneath me, that garrison shrinking to a gray speck against the red plains, I felt nothing. I should have felt relief, freedom, the weight of a nightmare lifting. But there was only emptiness, and the cold certainty that I was not escaping Varek's world so much as carrying it with me. Encoded in every falsified document I had signed, every crime I had witnessed and ignored, every small surrender that had transformed me from a believer in imperial justice to a cog in its machinery of exploitation. I still have the chronometer. I'm looking at it now as I record this confession. The date on its face marks the beginning of my corruption, but I've never been able to throw it away. Perhaps because throwing it away would feel too much like absolution, like a symbolic cleansing that I haven't earned and don't deserve. Perhaps because keeping it is a form of penance, a reminder that I cannot forget, that I must not forget, that the person I became on Varek's world is still part of me, waiting beneath the surface like a sickness in remission. Denagra was everything Varek's world was not. Peaceful, clean, properly administered. The garrison commander there was a by-the-book bureaucrat who cared more about inspection scores than anything else, and I learned to be the officer he expected, efficient, unremarkable, invisible. I filed accurate reports. I maintained proper protocols. I followed regulations with the mechanical precision of someone who has learned that rules are a refuge, a shield against the chaos that lurks outside their boundaries. I told myself I had left the corruption behind. I told myself I was clean now, redeemed by distance and routine. I told myself a lot of things, but the truth has a way of surfacing. 2 years after my transfer, I received word that Varek's world had been subjected to an Imperial Security Bureau investigation. A new agent, ambitious and apparently uncompromised, had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have and refused to look away. The investigation unraveled Messon's network with brutal efficiency. Arrests, executions, reassignments. The colonel himself died in custody. Suicide, according to the official report, though I heard rumors of a different kind. When the ISB cleanses corruption, it does so thoroughly, erasing not just the perpetrators, but anyone who might remember inconvenient details. Captain Torv was among those who disappeared. I learned about it from a fragment of gossip overheard in a cantina, a casual mention of that mess on the outer rim, from an officer who had no idea I had any connection to it. Just a name on a list of personnel transferred to a penal battalion on the front lines, which was the Empire's euphemism for a death sentence administered in installments. I thought about him for a long time afterward. About our Dejarik games, our empty conversations, the confession he had made about the Twi'lek girl, about the fact that he had tried to warn me, tried to give me a choice, tried to do one small, decent thing in a situation where decency had been stripped of meaning. He deserved better. They all did. The girl he couldn't save. The slaves who passed through that garrison on their way to lives of suffering. The officers who were destroyed for trying to do right. And the officers who were destroyed for doing wrong. And all the countless anonymous victims of a system that turned human beings into resources to be exploited and discarded. And I deserved worse. That's the truth I've carried for all the years since. The truth I'm finally putting into words, not because I expect forgiveness, I don't, but because silence has become its own kind of prison, and I need to escape it, even if the escape leads nowhere. I served the Empire for another decade after Danagra. I rose through the ranks, slowly but steadily, the way unremarkable officers do when they avoid mistakes and outlast their competition. I was stationed on Lothal during the early days of the rebel insurgency there. I processed supply requisitions for a star destroyer that later participated in the pacification of Jeddah. I attended a briefing once where an intelligence officer mentioned the Death Star project in tones of hushed reverence, describing it as the ultimate expression of Imperial will, the weapon that would end all resistance forever. I never returned to the depths of corruption I had known on Varek's world. But I never truly escaped them either. The Empire I served was the same empire that had allowed that corruption to flourish, that had, in fact, depended on it, relied on men like Messin to maintain control through fear and exploitation in the places where the pristine facade of imperial order couldn't reach. Every time I put on my uniform, every time I saluted a superior or disciplined a subordinate or filed a report, I was participating in a system built on the suffering of beings I had been trained to view as resources rather than people. The destruction of the first Death Star changed nothing, despite what the rebels claimed. Alderaan had already happened. Billions dead in an instant, vaporized to prove a point. And the Empire's official response was to classify anyone who mourned them as a potential dissident. I remember the day the news reached my posting, the shockwave of disbelief that passed through even the most loyal officers, the questions no one dared ask aloud, the suffocating weight of realization that there were no lines the Empire would not cross. I think that was when I stopped believing, not in one dramatic moment of revelation, but in a slow, grinding process of erosion, as the ideals I had clung to crumbled under the accumulated weight of evidence I could no longer ignore. The Empire I had served was not order. It was control. It was power for the sake of power, justified by propaganda so pervasive that even its perpetrators had begun to believe it. And I was complicit in all of it. Not just the corruption of Varek's world, but the larger corruption of which it was merely a symptom. When the second Death Star fell at Endor, when the Emperor died and Vader with him, when the Rebel Alliance declared itself the New Republic and the galaxy erupted into a chaos of fragmentation and civil war, I did something I had never done before. I walked away. Not heroically, not dramatically. I simply stopped. I filed a medical leave request citing combat fatigue, which wasn't entirely a lie. I took a transport to a neutral world, found a room in a city where no one asked questions, and I stopped being Lieutenant Kessin Vor, Imperial officer. I became someone else. Someone with no rank, no uniform, no chain of command, no falsified documents requiring my signature, no masters to obey, and no subordinates to command. Someone who could finally begin to reckon with what he had done and what he had failed to do. That was 7 years ago. I'm older now, grayer, slower. The New Republic's justice has swept through the galaxy, prosecuting war criminals, dismantling the Imperial apparatus, building something that might be better than what came before. I've watched it happen from a distance, followed the trials and the testimonies, the revelations of atrocities that make Varek's world seem almost quaint by comparison. No one has come for me. Perhaps my crimes were too small to register on the scale of galactic reckoning. Perhaps the records of my service were lost in the chaos of the Empire's collapse. Perhaps I'm simply lucky. If luck is the right word for a reprieve that feels more like a prolongation of punishment than a pardon. But I can't hide from myself. That's what I've learned in these 7 years of anonymity. You can change your name, your location, your circumstances. You can build a new life on the ruins of the old. But you can't outrun your own memory. You can't escape the person you became when the pressure was on and the choices were hard and you chose wrong, over and over. Again, until choosing wrong was the only thing you knew how to do. I think about them constantly. The slaves I never saw but knew were there. The officers who died trying to do right. Captain Torv, drinking himself to numbness in a common room while horror churned in the locked sections of the base. Colonel Messin, smiling his cold smile as he explained how the real Empire worked. The stormtroopers who followed orders because that was what stormtroopers did, and the ones who followed orders because they enjoyed it, and the ones who followed orders because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. I think about the girl Torv mentioned, the Twi'lek, 16 years old, who looked at him and said nothing as they took her away. I don't know what happened to her. I'll never know. But I imagine her sometimes, in the small hours of the night when sleep won't come, and the chronometer on my bedside table catches the light from the window. I imagine her surviving somehow, finding freedom, building a life. I imagine her happy because the alternative, the statistically probable alternative, given what I know about the slave trade and its destinations, is something I cannot bear to contemplate. I imagine her forgiving me. She wouldn't, of course. She shouldn't. If she knew what I had done, what I had allowed to happen, what I had become in that garrison on the edge of the Rust Flats, she would hate me. And she would be right. But I imagine it anyway, because imagination is all I have left. Imagination and this confession, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, setting these words down will serve some purpose beyond my own unburdening. This is what the Empire did to me. This is what I did to myself. This is the truth about the most corrupt garrison in the Outer Rim. Told by someone who was there, who participated, who survived when better people did not. I don't expect absolution. I don't expect understanding. I don't even expect to be believed, because the records are gone and the witnesses are dead. And I am just an old man, with a chronometer and a conscience that will not let him rest. But I need to say it. I need to put it into words that exist outside my own head. Words that someone else might read, words that might serve as a warning or a memorial or simply a scream into the void. The Empire was not one thing. It was a million things, a million variations on a theme of power and control and corruption, playing out on a million worlds in a million different ways. What I experienced on Varek's world was one version, perhaps more blatant than most, perhaps more concentrated, but not fundamentally different from what happened everywhere the Empire's shadow fell. The same dynamics that allowed Messin to build his criminal empire were present in every sector, every system, every garrison and star destroyer and administrative office. The machinery of oppression was too vast and too complex for any single person to see in its entirety. But we were all part of it. All of us who wore the uniform. All of us who followed orders. All of us who kept our heads down and our mouths shut and told ourselves we were just doing our jobs. We were the Empire. Not the Emperor, not Vader, not the Grand Moffs and Admirals who made the decisions that shattered worlds. We were the ones who made those decisions possible. The functionaries, the officers, the soldiers, the bureaucrats, the ones who processed the paperwork and maintained the supply chains and kept the machine running. Without us, the Empire would have been nothing. A hollow ideology, a fantasy of order, without the means to impose it. And we chose to do it. Every day, in 1,000 small ways. We chose complicity over conscience, obedience over integrity, survival over sacrifice. We told ourselves we had no choice. But that was always a lie. There was always a choice. There was always the option to refuse, to resist, to stand up and say no. This is wrong. I will not be part of this. Some people made that choice. They were braver than me. They were better than me. Many of them died, and the galaxy is poorer for their absence. I made the other choice, and I have to live with that every day, for however many days I have left. I'm tired now, tired of carrying this weight, tired of the nightmares that never quite fade, tired of the person I see when I look in the mirror. But I'm not tired enough to stop fighting. Not against the Empire. That fight is over, won by people who deserved the victory more than I ever could. I'm fighting against myself, against the part of me that still wants to rationalize, justify, explain away, against the voice in my head that says, I was just one person, I couldn't have made a difference, it wasn't really my fault. It was my fault. It is my fault. And saying that, admitting that, forcing myself to look at the truth without flinching, that's all the resistance I have left to offer. Maybe it's not enough. Maybe nothing I do now can balance the scales, can undo the harm I participated in, can honor the memory of those who suffered while I looked away. Maybe confession without consequence is just another form of self-indulgence, a way of processing guilt without actually paying for it. But it's what I have. It's all I have. So here it is, my testimony, my confession, my accounting of what happened inside the most corrupt Imperial Garrison in the Outer Rim, and what it did to me, and what I did to let it happen. Do with it what you will. Judge me, condemn me, forget me. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that the truth exists now, outside my head in words that can be read and remembered and perhaps someday understood. What matters is that I finally said it. What matters is that I tried. The chronometer is still ticking. 16 years, 4 months, 17 days since I stepped off that shuttle onto the red dust of Varek's world. The date on its face has never changed. But everything else has. Everything except the weight. That never changes. That never goes away. That's the price. And I will pay it. Every day, until the day I stop paying anything at all. This is my confession. This is my truth. This is the Empire. This is me.